It's lovely to see you all. Good morning. This is the most exciting day of the year for opinion pollsters. Probably not for everybody else, but there you go. At 10 o'clock, the most accurate opinion poll of all, which is the exit poll, takes place. And that has been pretty accurate in the last 3 general elections. There wasn't one with the Brexit referendum. So frankly, look at that. If you see a large Conservative lead, go to sleep. If you don't, then you will have an exciting night in store. And to be honest, although we've had some ups and downs in politics over the last few years, this is still, looking at all of the numbers, as I have been, I'm afraid, all night. We finished the Evening Standard poll that we will publish in the Evening Standard today at about 11:30 this morning. We finished that at about 5 a.m. Many of the team have been at it for some time. It is an interesting time, and there are some dynamics which we'll talk about that were not expected. And it's, as they say in the military, all plans or all strategy dissolves on first contact with the enemy, and that is certainly what has happened to the Conservatives' election campaign this time. If you want the slides, do email me. I'm sure they'll be on the movers and shakers slide, and you can go on Twitter and say what you think. But before I start talking about the election, I think it is just worth reminding ourselves of the photo of the year last year here, and also just a reminder of uncertainty. Donald is now the most unpopular president at this point in his presidency ever. Nigel, of course, spent 20 years trying to get us out of the European Union, finally succeeded, and then saw his party basically have its head blown off of a 12-bore by Mrs. May. And none, apart from Nicola Sturgeon, of the leaders currently competing for your votes in today's general election were in office at the 2015 general election. So life comes at you fast. And the other reason for focusing on Nigel Farage and Donald Trump and the events of last year that they represent is partly because they represent the popular feeling against virtually everything people in this room are about. One of the trends that we've looked at in our global trends report that we produce every couple of years is called the crisis of the elites. And what Brexit was and what Donald Trump was last year were just the crystallization of feelings that are present right across the Western world. And this is a global study. So you've got 71% of people saying, my government doesn't care about me. You've got 59% saying, I don't identify with what my country's become. In France and America, that's nearly 7 out of 10 people. The economy is rigged for the advantage of the rich and powerful. That unites voters all across the world, even in lovely Sweden. I don't know if any Swedes are here. Even in Sweden, 56% think that that is the case. And why is this like this, when actually overall poverty is falling in the world, governments actually are more transparent than ever? That's why we know about all the things they get up to. And it's partly, of course, that stagnation in living standards in many Western countries, the fall in real wages, the decline of the middle classes in America. And although I put up a funny photo of Donald and Nigel in their golden lift, the billionaire man of the people, it's interesting, actually, Italians always do these things best. Are any Italians in the room? Right, well, so Italy always does things best. So, think of another politician, billionaire, man of the people, needs to get involved in politics to drain the swamp, likes women a lot, We've seen it before. Doesn't usually end well, anyway. But these feelings are there, and they're not going to go away whatever the result of the election is, which is that probably, bizarrely, the populist revolt in Britain sees the good old Conservative Party stay in power, but those feelings aren't going away, and we in business should think about them. So, what's happening? I'm not allowed to show you the results of the poll that will be in the Evening Standard at 11:30, but I will just talk a bit about what has happened in the polls. And the first is that this wasn't supposed to happen. Generally, this was supposed to be like 1983. A left-wing Labour Party goes along to meet the electorate and sees its vote share decline once the electorate starts to get to grips with its leader and its policies. Instead, we've seen actually a marked narrowing of the gap. And many of the electorate, and of course this is perhaps what some political anoraks forget, do not remember the 1980s because they were not alive. They like free things, and they like the idea of rich people and by the way, most people in Britain believe that anybody on over £80,000 a year is definitely rich. They like the idea of rich people paying a lot more tax. And, of course, one of the things that the Conservative government has done is made sure that lots of people don't pay any tax at all. They've taken them out of tax. So taxes going up doesn't particularly bother them. And so free things are attractive. And then, of course, we come on to the leaders. Mrs. May has met the voters. These are her ratings. She started off with ratings that were actually higher than Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher at the start of the campaign. Quite impressive. And then, of course, it turned out that the reason she'd been able to become the longest-serving Home Secretary since the 19th century was simply by not talking to anybody, keeping everything deeply under control, only trusting 2 people. And then it turned out that running an election campaign on that basis was more tricky. Meanwhile, Mr. Corbyn, despite his past with Hamas, the IRA, Little Red Book, you name it, of course, actually seemed rather reasonable to lots of people compared to how he'd been painted. And, of course, didn't appear to be about to cost them any money. So, that is the story of the campaign, Mrs. May squandering a massive lead at the start of the campaign. But nevertheless, what might happen? Most people have already made up their minds, and more so than previous elections. So back in the last time we had a left-wing Labour Party versus a centre-right Conservative Party, 81% had decided to vote at the time of the campaign. Now, 78, we've still got 20% might change their mind. About 10% of the population actually decide in the polling station. Now, this is a problem for me, given that I have to, by law, stop the interviewing at 9 o'clock last night, which is why the exit poll that we are currently conducting in hundreds of polling stations in marginal constituencies around Britain is much more likely to be right than any of the polling numbers that I might talk about in a second, because at least we know they've voted. We can be sure they have voted, which is good. And they might have made up their mind at that point or be able to remember what they did 5 minutes ago. So, we've got quite high certainty. And one of the key features of this election, of course, is this massive divide. There is now a bigger divide by age in Britain than there is by class. It used to be that posh people voted Conservative and working class people voted Labour. Now it's simply that if you're young, you tend to vote Labour, and if you're older, you tend to vote Conservative. The interesting thing about this chart, of course, is that if you're a Conservative, you should probably be much happier about having a higher bar at this end of the chart, for the reason being the over 55s vote, the under 30s not so much. At the last general election, only 44% of the 18 to 24-year-olds bothered to go and vote. So they might like Labour, but the question is whether they will suddenly discover where the polling station is in time. Many of them are not registered. There are 7 million people who are eligible to vote in Britain, according to the Electoral Commission, who are not actually registered to vote. So will they get there and decide they weren't registered and they can't actually vote? We don't know. But certainly that is softer. And one of the big unknowns in this election, and it's why you're seeing a spread in the final polls. So the final polls today, so far, the published ones, range from +1 for the Conservatives at one extreme, to +13 at the other extreme. So no complaints about herding there. Somebody is going to be very right and somebody is going to be very wrong. And if the +1 turns out to be right, personally I think that's a bit spicy. But if it does turn out to be right, it will be because finally young people have woken up to the fact that they're going to be generation rent, that the pensioners have had the triple lock. They have noticed that their incomes have fallen on average by 7% since the crash, whereas pensioner incomes have on average increased by 11%, and they've decided to do something about it. However, it will be very, very unusual if that happens, so we will know later on. Because who actually goes to the polling station? There is the historic data on turnout. The red ones are the young ones, the yellow ones are the older ones, etc. And as you can see, the young always less likely to vote. So for something unusual to happen at this election, that red line has suddenly got to shoot upwards this time. Now at Brexit, I turned a perfectly good 51% for leave in the morning of the referendum. That was the raw data I had. I didn't believe it, because I had lots of people who didn't normally bother voting, old working class people, who of course told us they hated Europe, but also told us they didn't bother voting normally, who did. And so I turned that 51% into 48%, because I made a judgment. So this time I'm making a judgment that the young aren't going to vote in quite the numbers that they say they will. So hold on to your hats. And another reason why I think Mrs. May is going to win is that despite her decline in being the best Prime Minister from 61 to 50, and despite Jeremy going up from 23% to 35%, she retains a lead. Now, in my final poll, those numbers may have changed slightly, but that is a big difference. And, you know, the person who gets to be Prime Minister is always actually the person who comes out best on this question. We have never done an election where that was not the case. So again, if you're worried about the actual closeness of the polls, that question might give you a clue. The best Prime Minister and best on the economy normally wins. The other way of doing all of this, of course, is simply to ask the public not how they're going to vote, but what will happen. Do they know better than us what might happen? Some people like to look at betting markets. My advice on that, and indeed from political betting, the website is not to do so. Anyway, but you can. But you can also ask the public what will happen. So in 1983, the public said that the Conservatives would win. In 92, they said the Conservatives would win. In 97, 2001 and 2005, they predicted a Labour majority. In 2010, they said the Conservatives would win, so they were wrong then, hung Parliament. In 2015, they said the Conservatives would win, but they weren't quite sure, very small Conservative majority. So what are they thinking this time? So again, they're pretty sure about what's going to happen, but that was that was a couple of weeks ago, and things have happened since then. So we will see. Very exciting. Stay awake till at least 10. Once you see if you see a large Conservative majority, go to sleep. Because last time I polled you in this room, I didn't see a lot of Labour voters, but there may be some now. But otherwise, it should be a very, very interesting night indeed. Thank you very much.